I'm really excited to be here. I'm Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, and I'm an EJW Fellow hosted by American Gateways in Austin, Texas. We're an immigration legal services provider, and I'm sponsored by the Aiken Gump Law Firm, a really terrific sponsor. I'm going to talk to you today about defining your role as a fellow and claiming your leadership within your role, and also about remembering the importance of human connection and relationship development in your work. I'm going to do things in a reverse and start my story at the end. I'm very happy to say that on August 6th of this year, the Obama administration made the terrific announcement that they plan to end the horrific federal practice of the detention of families of immigrants at the Don Hutto Detention Center. Yeah. This was a huge success. Let me set the stage for you a little bit. Don Hutto is located in Taylor, Texas, which is a teeny little town north of Austin, and it really only has one thing going for it, and that is this detention center. It's named after Don Hutto, who is the founder of the Corrections Corporation of America, America's largest privately run prison company. And in May of 2006, about 3 years ago, Michael Chertoff and the Bush administration announced an end to the federal practice of catch and release, where immigrants, not fish, but immigrants who came to the U.S. border or were coming across the U.S. border were issued notices to appear in immigration court and expected to come to their immigration hearings. And there was a fear that not enough people were showing up for their hearings, so a decision was made to detain these people during the pendency of their trials. But a big part of the population coming across the border were families of immigrants who had fled persecution in their countries and were seeking asylum here. And in an effort to maintain family unity, the decision was made to house entire families at this former medium security prison. I will never forget my first visit to Hutto. I was a second-year law student at the University of Texas, and I was in the immigration clinic, and my professor and incredible mentor, Barbara Hines, asked me to go to Hutto and conduct an intake with a family of Iraqi Christians. I'll call them the Ibrahims. Mr. and Mrs. Ibrahim were Chaldean Christians, which is an ancient sect of Catholicism that still exists in the Middle East today. And following the U.S. invasion of Iraq and at the height of the sectarian violence, things were particularly dangerous for people seen as having ties to the West, like interpreters or Christians. In addition, Mr. Ibrahim had a business installing cable satellites in people's homes, which would stream cable TV images. A lot of these images were considered forbidden or haram by some extremists, and he had received several death threats and was eventually kidnapped and held for ransom. And Mrs. Ibrahim sold most of the family's assets in order to obtain his release. And when he was released, he was told that if he was caught installing these cable satellites any longer, he would be killed. And so this young couple made a really difficult choice to leave their country and come to the U.S. to seek asylum, even though Mrs. Ibrahim was pregnant with their first baby. And they began their journey to the United States, and they arrived at the U.S. border, and they asked for asylum. They did not seek across the border. And they were handcuffed, and they were taken to Hutto. And the reason that this first interview was so memorable for me was because after a few minutes, Mrs. Ibrahim asked me if I would hold her baby, because she said that I carried the scent of the outside world, and that her baby hadn't been outside in days. And when the interview came to an end, I went to hand her baby back to her. And crying, she asked me to sneak her baby out of this facility. The conditions were really terrible at that time. It's a former medium security prison, and nobody thought about what it was going to be like to house families there. They ran it like a prison. There was barbed wire and bars everywhere. They conducted counts so that people had to stay in their cells for up to 12 hours per day. And they didn't allow toys in the cells. So can you imagine infants, toddlers, and young children in a cell with their parents and no toys for 12 hours per day? The food was awful. The kids wouldn't eat it and started losing weight across the board. They had one room, one classroom, and the kids went to school for 1 hour a day in the same room, regardless of their ability or their age. And there wasn't free movement. And as I said, they didn't go outside unless the weather was good, and then only up to an hour per day. my life changed that day. I went to Hutto. I realized that my only choice was to continue serving these people, and as a law student, I was really lucky because the UT Immigration Clinic and the ACLU brought litigation against the facility, and there was a lot of media surrounding the litigation. There were reports in the BBC, the New Yorker, the New York Times. There were 2 documentaries, and there were vigils and protests and marches, and I got to participate in all of this. And one Canadian boy detained at Hutto wrote a plea to his prime minister for release that ended up all over the Canadian media. I'm happy to say that the litigation was successful in a lot of ways. They weren't able to close down the facility, but they settled for tremendously improved conditions. And there was free movement, the count system was eradicated, the food improved, the school was expanded to 7 hours per day. They started field trips for the kids. But it was still a prison. And it remained this way until closing in 2009. But right after the litigation in the fall of 2007 was when I began my fellowship application process, and I knew that I wanted to provide rights presentations to the families at Hutto and also pro bono representation, train and organize pro bono representation and do direct representation. And I had to think about what my role was going to be. I knew that I had to foster a relationship of trust with the people who ran the facility. And they were really jumpy toward outsiders because of the litigation. Most reporters were kept out, and international rights organizations like the Women's Refugee Commission and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I was really scared that I would get this fellowship and then I would get shut out of the facility and then the whole thing would be a wash. And so I started to decline requests to attend press conferences, and I stopped going to the vigils and the marches. And as a result of that, I had a good relationship with the people who ran the facility, and I think I was more effective because they accommodated my schedule, they cleared my volunteers, I had cell phone numbers for the deportation officers, I could call case managers in if I had any problems. They provided interpretation services for me that they paid for. They provided snacks at my presentations. And when the announcement came out in August that they were closing the facility, at first I felt like, no, I can't claim any part of that success because I just went in and gave presentations. But after some reflection and talking to my mentors and the people here at EJW, I realized that leadership looks a lot of different ways. And I consciously chose an inside strategy. And I think that ultimately it worked. And now I do claim some of the success of the closing of Hutto. This July, I learned another very important lesson about developing human relationships and connections in our work. It was just before July 4th weekend, and I went to Hutto to offer a rights presentation, and I give consultations after my presentations, and I met this young woman, Sarah. She was from the Horn of Africa, and she was detained at Hutto with her little boy. And I was doing a consultation with her, and we went into the room, and I asked to see her immigration paperwork. And as I looked at it, my heart sank because I realized that Sarah had been placed under something called expedited removal, which is for people who are new to the U.S. And for people under expedited removal, in order to even have the right to seek asylum, you have to pass something called a credible fear interview. And Sarah, I think, as a result of some serious PTSD and tough interviewers, had failed both her credible fear interview and her only opportunity for appeal. But I was reading the transcripts of her interview, and I realized that I didn't think it was possible, considering what had happened to her. And so I called the deportation officer in, and I stepped out of the room, and I showed him the paperwork, and I said, "What happened? This isn't possible." And he said, "It is possible, and actually she has her passport, and so we're going to be able to get her travel documents any day now, and she'll be deported probably within the week." I have to give bad news a lot in my job, but this was a tough one, and so I steeled myself for a hard conversation, and I went back into the interview room with her and her little boy, and I said, I didn't think there was anything that could be done, that she was going to be deported any day. And she fell apart. And I will never forget the look that her son gave me because of what I had done to her. And then I went home that day and I couldn't get it out of my mind what had happened to her. Sarah was married, and her husband practiced a denomination of the Christian faith that wasn't allowed or recognized by their government. And one day he was caught praying with his Bible and was arrested. And naturally, she went to the police station and sought information on his whereabouts, at which point she was arrested. And what followed in the next few months of her life, I don't think any of us could really imagine. She, at first, was held in an underground cell with no ventilation, a little room. She slept and went to the bathroom on the same floor. She was given very little water, not enough food, and she was beaten and interrogated every day. And during one of her interrogations, she expressed opposition to her government, and then was transferred to a facility that was even worse. She was held in a metal cargo shipping container in the middle of the desert. And during the day, she was tied up in something they call the helicopter position, where her elbows and her ankles were tied, bound together behind her back. And she was held in this contorted position in the sun with no water for hours, all day. She lost consciousness and was transferred to a unit with more detainees who fed her water with a dirty, soaked rag, and she survived. And she and her husband were released, and they were forced into the military, which is very common there. And they were stationed near each other, and they were able to meet up on the weekends. Only her husband was caught in a prayer group again and was arrested and has not been seen or heard from since. So naturally, Sarah started asking her officers what happened to her husband, and she got arrested again. Only this time, she was in the second trimester of her pregnancy. And even though she pled with her captors, she was beaten with rifles and kicked with combat boots and raped. I was desperate to do something for her, but everybody I talked to said there's nothing that can be done. There's an obscure appeals process if you can show that conditions in her country have changed, which they hadn't. But then I remembered something important, and that is that even those who enforce the rules are human. And so I decided I was going to appeal to the supervisor at the Houston Asylum Office to give her a new interview. And so I spent my July 4th weekend with her, putting together an affidavit, and I put together country conditions research. I wrote a long letter to the supervisor, and I quoted the asylum officer training manual, particularly the part about the low threshold for credible fear interviews and the need for sensitivity in dealing with victims of trauma and torture. And I overnighted, I faxed it, I PDF'd, I started calling. And 2 days later, I got a phone call from the supervisor saying that he didn't give me what I wanted, which was a new interview. He had reversed the decision, and he called her deportation officer and had him halt her deportation. And the next time I went to Hutto, there was a line of people waiting for my presentation. And it's actually always that way, but she ran into the room and hugged me and wouldn't let go. And I mean, other detainees were crying watching us. It was just incredibly moving. I think that, as lawyers, we're taught to fight and to litigate. And I think it's important to remember that even our adversaries are humans and they have emotions. And a lot of times in dealing with bureaucracy, people can be real jerks. But sometimes, as leaders, we need to utilize all of the resources in our toolkit. I get this wrong a lot, and my mistakes are some of my biggest teachers. A couple months ago, I won a case for a client, and he should have been released, but the government attorney appealed the decision. And my client was subject to mandatory detention, and so he had to stay detained throughout the pendency of appeal. He was looking at, 6 to 9 months longer. And he'd call me every day, and I'd say, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. His girlfriend would call me. She was having trouble feeding the baby. And 6 weeks later, I got a call from my client, and he said he heard this rumor that the government attorney wanted to let him out. And I thought it sounded really far-fetched, but I called the government attorney, and it turns out he only wanted a couple documents from me that I got within 48 hours to drop the whole appeal. And because I didn't pick up the phone, my client languished in detention for 6 weeks. And what did I have to lose? And that was a hard lesson, but it's another valuable lesson in reaching out to the other side. All of us are doing such different things, and it's hard to craft a message up here that applies to everybody. Maybe this would never work for you. But one thing that we all have in common is that all of us are leaders, and part of our job here this week is to think about what kind of leaders we're going to be and to think about our fellowships. I'm happy to tell you that everybody in my stories are all out of detention and they're living with their families freely today, and I'm very grateful to them because they've been my teachers and they've helped me become a better lawyer and a better leader and a better person. Thank you.